Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Today, we're going to talk about different ways of finding accommodation. So imagine you arrive in the UK, you don't know anybody, but you have a job contract. How do you find a place to live? Well, if you have enough money, if you have a lot of savings, you could try to use an estate agent. An estate agent isn't allowed to charge you for their services. They will charge the landlord. It's like a mediator, kind of like a job agency. They work with landlords, and their job is to make sure that you have all the correct documentation, you have money, and you have enough, let's say, savings to last you if you're not working. They look into your finances. They want to make sure that you have no criminal records, and they want to make sure that you understand the responsibilities of renting. Estate agents are very good, but on the other hand, using an estate agent is usually a little bit expensive. They might ask you to pay 3 months' rent in advance. They might ask you to pay 2 months' rent in advance or 3 months' rent in advance plus a deposit, which again may be 1 month's rent in advance or 2 months' rent in advance. If you're trying to rent a 1-bedroom apartment, for example, then that could really add up, and you could find yourself spending all your money with an estate agent, and that's not ideal. Also, an estate agent will use a credit agency to look into your background. So if you have any problems with debt or any problems with previous landlords, they will know about it. If you're coming from abroad, they won't look into your background, but what they will ask for is that someone else gives them a guarantee. Let me give you an example. So I went to live in Spain for 5-6 years in 2014. When I came back to the UK, I had no credit history because I didn't have a bank account here for many years. So I went to an estate agent to rent a place, and they said, we have no records of you earning any money here. So we need to ask you to find someone who will promise to pay us if you ever stop paying us. So I quickly had to find a friend, and it had to be someone who was living in the UK. They didn't have to be British, and someone who was earning over a certain amount, and someone who would make that promise in writing to pay my rent if I ever stopped. Of course, I never had to use that person or his money, but I had to give that promise. That's probably what's going to happen to you if you try to use an estate agent, especially if you've just arrived here. It might be possible that your employer will help you out there. If your employer has arranged for your visa to get to the UK, then I think it's safe to say that you can rely on him to speak up for you when you try to find accommodation. Or a sympathetic colleague or boss might also do the same. But certainly you should go to your employer and ask if you find yourself in this situation. Or if you have a friend who's living in the UK who meets the criteria, you should definitely be ready to ask them. So the estate agent's way of finding accommodation is a little bit tricky. You'll need to know someone, you need to have a lot of money, and you really need to know that you have to wait, because while the estate agent is looking into your background, and that can take up to 6 or 8 or even 10 weeks, you have to find somewhere to live. If you're in temporary accommodation, which is okay with that, that's fine. But if you find yourself in a hotel for that amount of time, that could be a problem. Of course, we have the other systems like Airbnb, which may be suitable for a short time. As I mentioned earlier, landlord registrations are also very, very important. All landlords are registered on a special register. Landlords, when they register on the government's registration scheme, are given a registration number. And when you look in the estate agent window at apartments, one notice you might see is landlord registration pending, meaning they're still waiting for the number to be allocated if it's a new landlord. It is illegal not to be registered on the registration scheme. The 4 countries of the UK all have different registration schemes, and all landlords must be registered on one of them. So, for example, if you go to London and you try to rent an apartment, there should clearly be a number. The landlord should give you his number, and you have a right to ask for his registration number. Any estate agent has an obligation to show you or tell you about the landlord's registration. When you come to the UK and you don't use an estate agent, for example, you use a bulletin board or maybe a Facebook post and someone is offering you accommodation, if they're not registered on the registration scheme, you should be a little bit concerned. Any landlord who is responsible and who is taking your money must be registered on the government's registration scheme. The reason why this is very, very important is because the registration scheme takes the deposit. So, you know, when you rent an apartment, you have to give them 1 month's rent in advance or 2 months' rent in advance, and then you have to give them a deposit, which you might not get back if you wreck the place. Okay, that deposit is given to the registration system. It's held by the government and in turn is given back to you when you leave that apartment. The landlord can't touch it and he can't access it, so he has to pay the landlord registration your deposit, and then the registration, the registry as it's known, will send you a direct letter to say, okay, we're holding your deposit, not your landlord, and when you leave, you will get it back, and your landlord will advise us how much to return to you. And this is to stop any abuse of the system. So you have to know that your deposit is fully protected, and you have a right to question how much you're going to get back from that registry via your landlord if you ever decide to leave. So these are 2 things that you need to look out for. Firstly, the registration number of the landlord, and secondly, whether the landlord, of course, has a good reputation. When it comes to things like Airbnb or a friend of a friend who says, yeah, you can stay with me, I rent out rooms, it's up to you if you really want to question if they're registered, because it's possible that some people do rent out their properties without being registered, but that is illegal. And you could end up in trouble if it is known eventually that your landlord isn't registered and that you knew about it. I don't suppose you would get into big trouble, but you certainly might lose any money that he owes you. So when you come to the UK and you meet someone who's offering you accommodation, one of the first questions you should ask is, are you a registered landlord? Because you're supposed to be. And depending on your arrangement with that person, maybe you want to overlook the fact, or maybe you want to encourage the person to be registered. Sometimes when it comes to finding accommodation, we don't have time to question whether the landlord is registered because we just need a place to live, But you could end up having a legal problem or even be in big trouble with the police if you knew that landlord wasn't registered. But worst case scenario, I think you would probably just end up losing your deposit. Anyway, that's the registration scheme. So everyone is going to ask you for a deposit. There's no question about that. So you would need to have at least some savings with you. The estate agents are going to ask you for 2 or 3 months in advance and a deposit. The other landlord that you find through Facebook, etc., you could probably negotiate with them. And it's going to be all about trust, how well you know them, how well they know you, and how well you trust each other. And that's never easy. Companies often use the internet to advertise, and there's loads of those around. You can easily find them by doing a Google search. More informal ones often use Twitter or Facebook, or sometimes websites like Craigslist or Gumtree. These are very popular, but you would have to be very, very careful because you really don't know who you're meeting. You really don't know if you can trust them. And maybe one way of gaining trust is by looking to see if they're registered. Because they may be registered and just don't want to use an estate agent, because estate agents are very expensive for landlords. But finding nice people sometimes is a little bit of a problem. So, estate agents or internet, make sure that the landlord is registered before you start dealing with him. He should have a number, and on the websites of the registries, as I mentioned, each part of the Union, Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales have their own registries. You can insert his number and just make sure that he's genuine. I hope you found this helpful. Let's talk again soon. Bye-bye.